Hello and welcome. Today I just wanted to bring in Jonathan to talk to him a little bit about his recent migration to blocks, something I did a couple years ago, and now I feel almost so removed from it. It's hard for me to remember all the stress and anxiety and figuring things out that went along with kind of making that switch. But there's so many people at this point really getting into the point where they're getting curious, blocks curious, and trying to figure it all out. So I wanted to get the perspective of somebody who's a little bit fresher on this pivot than I am and kind of talk about some of the pros and cons. Even though we're both big fanboys of blocks, I think there are definitely cons that we can talk about in this call. So hopefully this will be helpful to anybody that's looking at making that switch and give you some kind of realistic expectations. So before we jump in here, Jonathan, I just want to say welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to do this call. And for anybody that doesn't know about you yet, why don't you give us a little bit of background on what it is you do?
Yeah, man. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's been a while since I've been here with you on your channel. It's funny because the tables have turned in this way where I did a live stream with you a couple years ago before your blocks transition about oxygen. And it was the exact same thing in reverse, which is really funny. So I run a small web agency that has focused for many years on oxygen builder websites. And I'm in the process of transitioning that to kind of more monthly focused sites. And then the other big piece of my day-to-day in my business and how I got connected with you, Kyle, and many others is from my YouTube channel that's called Permaslug. So I created oxygen tutorials on that for many years. But with some events this past summer, I decided to kind of continue looking elsewhere and landed on blocks. So you were a huge proponent of that for months and months, even before what I described this summer. And then my other good friend Taylor Drayson was also a big influence. So you two guys were constantly like, "Have you checked out blocks? Have you checked out blocks?" And I thought, no, I'll get around to it eventually. And within the last 6 months became eventually. So kind of transitioning my whole business to that, and then also, of course, all of my YouTube content. And it's been a fantastic transition. It's been a lot of fun. Learning. It's been really, really exciting. And I know I'm preaching to the choir with you, but they're just such fantastic tools that I am happy to be advocating for those now. So it's been great.
Well, I think it's, there's a lot of people that have made the move to blocks from something like Elementor, where I don't think the gap between the two is that huge. There's a lot of bells and whistles inside of Elementor that aren't inside most of the block packages. But you're coming from something like Oxygen, which in the WordPress world has probably the most flexibility. Like, you're closest to the code. You can do just about anything. And that's not really how I would explain blocks most of the time. So I don't think the normal transition for people is to go from Oxygen to blocks. But so besides me pestering you and Taylor pestering you, what was the allure to go from something where you had that much control, everything's class-based, you can really dig into everything, to something so much more simple like blocks?
Yeah, it's a great question. A huge piece of that was with my agency work. So the breakdown in terms of my time focus is about like 60-40 in favor of client work, and then the other 40% is on the YouTube and kind of content creation courses and stuff like that. And what I found was, like many people who have started creating WordPress tutorial videos, I would get a lot of clients from those videos who had incredibly complicated sites. And so I would spend hours and days and weeks building these incredibly complicated sites, which was fun, but it was almost like so abstract and like so difficult to scope them. It was difficult to come up with a price. The finish line always seemed to be moving. And so when I took some time off this summer, I just told myself, like, I've got to simplify my workflow. Like, I don't really want to sacrifice capability with my tool set, but what I do want is something that's just a whole lot easier, that perhaps somebody less technical, like in terms of clients or somebody on my team, could come behind me and do things that in Oxygen would have simply been impossible for somebody without a technical skill set. So a huge piece of the driving factor for me was just like simplifying my workflow, and then trying to just like shrink the technical requirement of the projects that I was working on. Like, instead of every single project requiring custom fields with repeaters and, huge code blocks and all that kind of stuff, like, I just had to make the decision, like, I don't want to be doing those sorts of things because the time spent and the focus and energy required and the expectations from the client were so much higher, and the cost increase just didn't work out. I wasn't any more profitable doing those big projects. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but really it came down to just like wanting a change in my own business. I wanted to simplify my clients and simplify my projects and tools. So that was probably one of the biggest factors. And I just thought, I know I'm going to run up against limitations, but we'll see, kind of cross those bridges as we come to them, as my mom would say.
Right. And that was a huge part for me too. It's like, obviously coming from, I spent a lot of time in Elementor and then a brief stint into Oxygen. And it was like, man, there's so many choices. There's so many widgets. There's so many everything. Like, this just becomes so freaking complicated. And that's great when you want to flex muscles and be creative and like just do all the things. That's great. But that's counterintuitive to like running a lean, profitable business. If I was just looking at this from the business standpoint, it's like, okay, how do we simplify these things and make them as simple as possible so they're repeatable and so we can have good margins on them and things like that. So the simpler you make that tech stack, you kind of end up more profitable that way too. At least that was my experience.
I totally agree, because like with the Oxygen sites, like your comment about flexing your creative, kind of juices is absolutely true. Like the depth of the things that you could create was immense. Like taking something like Oxygen and adding in ACF was like the possibilities. ACF is Advanced Custom Fields, if you don't know. The possibilities were essentially endless, and with a little bit of custom code, which it forced me to learn, which was awesome. You could do almost anything. And that was kind of my angle to clients, was like, we can pretty much do everything, which in hindsight was a mistake, because then the goalpost is always shifting of like, what do we want to achieve and when and how? And when I really looked at it, like the thing that I want to be doing for clients is building conversion focused sites that convert whatever it is, whether it's a local business that wants phone calls or something like that, or even online checkouts. And I would find with these Oxygen projects, the focus wasn't on something meaningful like conversions. It was on having a flashy website that did all these cool things and allowed their team to do X, Y, and Z, which, if you really break it down, wasn't actually necessary. And something that's interesting, I wanted to share this. I don't know if you and I have discussed this, but I created a poll in my Facebook group maybe a couple months ago, and I said, what kind of sites are you typically working on? And more than half of the people that responded, I think like 160 people responded. So something like 80 plus people said that they're working on simple brochure sites. There was 3 options. It said, simple brochure, e-commerce, and then like custom, lots of dynamic data. And I thought, I thought these simple brochure sites are so overkill in a tool like Oxygen or Bricks. So anyway, that I found extremely interesting, and stepping back from that world made me realize like 90% of the things that I want to do can be done in GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks. So again, I think I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but like you made the comment earlier about the gap between the tools, and I don't want to make this, a focus on Oxygen versus Blocks. That's not my intent at all. But like I've had people ask me, don't you miss certain features? And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there are certain things that don't quite exist natively, but I've been able to build some reasonably complex sites. And in fact, I took a site that was under development in Oxygen and ported it over to GeneratePress, and we lost nothing. So it's really interesting when you step back and really take a hard look at your tools. You might be surprised at what you find.
Yeah, and what I found, and I know I've mentioned this several times, is I think I used all the goodies and all the tools as like a crutch to be able to make the website look great or like flashy for the client without really having to think about like the design principles or the fundamentals or the conversions that we need to, it was a distraction from those things. And I do think like limiting the amount of tools I had to do all those things made me be more intentional about what I'm building. So I have to think more about layout and composition and scale and proportions and all those things that maybe I wasn't thinking about when I was just dragging in a bunch of things that kind of distracted from that. So for me, that's been definitely a huge part of it. But obviously there are limitations to it, right? Like there's not as many things you can do inside. Me and you both use GenerateBlocks. There's not as many things you can do inside of there natively that you could do in a tool like Oxygen or Bricks. So just having recently started making that migration and building more sites with GenerateBlocks, what are some of those like frustrating limitations that you've come up against?
I think probably the biggest thing would be and I've said this before, like my number one favorite feature in Oxygen was their conditions builder. So being able to dynamically show and hide elements based on like, anything from whether the user was logged in or not, or a URL parameter, or whether they were on a taxonomy page or whatever, anything you could think of, you could do in Oxygen, which was great. So that not being built in was something that initially was a huge hang up. That was what kept me away from blocks for a long time. I thought I can't live without these conditions. But with that, there's a plugin that's free, has a fantastic free version. I think it's called Block Visibility, and that got me like 90% of the way there. And then GeneratePress, their display rules feature, where you can choose where elements pop up, and combining that with hooks gets me pretty much everything that I want to do right out of the box. And then, I think the other thing is like you said, you sort of have to rethink what you're able to build from, because GenerateBlocks has what, like 6 elements out of the gate. And so you're like, wait a second, I'm missing like accordions and tabs. I'm missing a slider. I don't have, whatever. There's a bunch of other things, but I've always used those 3 examples: accordion, tab, and slider. And it just makes you rethink, like, okay, well, surely there's a way to go about this and still get the point across. And I was researching for a video that never came to light, the idea of how to do hover tooltips. And in the Mozilla docs, it specifically says, reconsider using a tooltip altogether. If it's important enough for the user to see, shouldn't it be in plain sight and not hidden behind a tooltip? And I thought, wow, that's so true. And the same thing is true with like accordions and tabs. They have their uses, obviously, but like, it really made me reconsider, just like you said, composition and layout is almost like a precursor to what element you're going to use. So I think probably the conditions, if I had to pick one.
I think those examples are good, because I've definitely used accordions as a crutch to not being able to come up with a good layout for something. It's like, I have a lot of content here. I'll just throw all of it into some accordions and we'll call it a day, because it's easy to make a lot of content look good because you're kind of hiding it away or in tabs or something. But that definitely is an opportunity to go, okay, well, when you get into things like accordions and tabs and sliders, you're also introducing a lot of accessibility that you might not be thinking about, because while all 3 of those things can be done accessible, they're really difficult, and a lot of tools do not do a good job of that, right? So if you just drag in some slider thing, chances are you're going to probably be introducing some accessibility problems into your website. So I like the docs in Mozilla saying, consider not using this at all. And that's kind of what I've done with the accordions and sliders and all those kinds of things. Now that there is some cool things coming to GenerateBlocks that are going to make all that a whole lot easier. But yeah, that's definitely one that I've run into as well. So go ahead.
On that same vein, real quick, I wanted to make one comment there. Another thing that is lacking, that anybody really from any builder is going to experience, is a pop-up or a modal. That doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in Gutenberg Core, and it also doesn't exist in GenerateBlocks. And initially, I realized that was a big crutch for me too, to hide things behind a modal, because it was easier to just slap it into a modal and move on in Oxygen. But that's not possible in GenerateBlocks. Again, obviously, you can accomplish pretty much anything you want with enough head bashing and Stack Overflow searching.
Right.
But that was one. And then now I don't use them. That's not really a thing that I even consider as an option. So that refactoring your own thought of like what can you work with, and the accessibility. We'll get to that, I'm sure, but accessibility is a huge one too. Like it's just become more top of mind, and GeneratePress handles so much of that for you,
Yeah.
which is just it's fantastic.
Yeah, and I will say, Cadence has a modal inside of there. I can't remember if it's in the free or the paid. I think it's in the paid one that works really well. From the limited accessibility testing I can do without a PhD in accessibility, it seemed to do pretty well as far as like putting the focus in the modal and returning it out of it when you close the modal and all those kinds of things. So it does fairly decent. But I'm the same way. Like I used to just hide a bunch of stuff behind modals because it was easier, because it looked cool, you know. And now I've just tried to figure out other ways to do it. Now I will say, as far as the limitations, I'm kind of glad that I took the path I did. With Elementor, I didn't need to know any code. I didn't know any code and was running an agency for a while. When I got into Oxygen, you don't have to know code, but you're going to be kind of up shit's creek without knowing some basics of it. So Oxygen really forced me to start learning a lot more, just CSS and HTML. So nothing extremely fancy, but it made me a lot more comfortable. And I will say that's really helped me in my transition to blocks too, because if there aren't the settings I need, because there's just fewer settings, like I can usually hop in and write the CSS I need to make it happen. So I do think that it's an easier transition for people that can at least go through and kind of modify or hack a few things that they need to if those settings aren't in there. Because I definitely find myself writing a lot of CSS, but part of that is I just enjoy doing it and like stretching myself to do that as well.
Kevin Powell would be proud.
Yes. I told somebody earlier today, I said, you know, I was working on something new today and showing it off. And I said, where did you go to find all this? Did you just Google it? And I'm like, you know what? I just started watching Kevin Powell videos like a couple years ago. And I watched him even when I didn't understand a word he was talking about. And I just thought, if I keep at this, eventually these things are going to start clicking. And that's exactly what happened. Just like things started clicking and I started figuring them out. And then I knew where to turn to go refresh myself on it. But yeah, that's definitely been a huge advantage, is I understand those things better. I think if I was coming straight from Elementor where I was then when I didn't know any code, this transition would be a little bit more difficult as well.
Yeah, for sure. I was gonna say on the Kevin Powell front, I was my girlfriend was telling me about a video and she said something about like madly in love, and my brain goes, I'm gonna help you fall deeply madly in love with CSS.
Yes.
I said that to her and she just looked at me like, what are you talking about?
They
I was
don't
like,
understand.
yeah.
All right, so those are some of the cons we can think about. What about the benefits? What surprising elements have you found in your switch?
I mean, one of the best pieces of it is, well, in terms of like wins that we haven't kind of already touched on, is the accessibility of the menu. And that's something that, again, I'm not here to make this an Oxygen Bash session, but even after all these years, the Oxygen menus are not keyboard accessible. And Adam Lowe's video, you know, he touched on that. So like that was a thing that was never really top of mind, but was a huge plus. Skip to content links, you know, other accessibility things that are just handled for you out of the gate. That was really awesome. But I think probably the number one piece of it, which is a GeneratePress feature, is the elements functionality. So that's almost like an Elementor or an Oxygen template, where like you can build certain layouts and apply them conditionally to certain places across your site. Like that piece alone is the key that allowed me to do what I explained earlier about taking that Oxygen site and porting it over to GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks. Without that elements feature, it wouldn't have been possible. So, I mean, I think the elements is so powerful, and like combining hooks, the display rules, and the conditions of, you know, custom plugin, like I mentioned, or not custom plugin, I mean a condition plugin, that enables you to get so far. And it's just fun. It's just like that. That's another thing about it that's like hard to convey, is like, I mean it when I say they're like genuinely fun tools to work in, because you're not getting lost in the weeds of like, what the hell did I just do to that section, and why is it not showing up anymore? So I don't know. I think it's probably that.
I think if I was going to guess what your answer to this was going to be, and it wasn't the answer you gave, I thought you were going to say how quickly the editor loads, because that is a huge benefit.
That's funny. I was thinking about that before this call this morning about some of the other things that I had forgotten about. You know, it's been quite a few months that I've been working in these tools, And that's something that I've just forgotten about. Like
Yeah.
that's one of those quality of life improvements that I had never really considered. And that, and then the ability to have more than one person working in the editor. I think the other thing for me is the ability to have cross-site copy and paste, which I know like Elementor has that and Oxygen now has it and stuff. But the thing that's allowed me to do is like build sort of the basic foundation of global styles in my sites and have like consistent color names. And now what I can do is take a section from one site and literally just Control C, Control V into a new site. And it picks up all the styles, all the structure, every piece of, functionality that was there. And we have started building like a hub site. I don't really have a name for it, but it just like as we're building sites, we're just throwing these sections into this site. So when we get that random care plan request of, hey, I have this awful looking piece of content that I need you to throw into the site, I can go find something and just copy and paste it in. And in a matter of 5 minutes, I've built a section. So that also kind of ties into the generate blocks local patterns too, sort of like your own local template library on your site. And those features are just like, in terms of one of my other big goals with switching was to just increase efficiency overall, just through every project. And those kinds of things are what, sort of make the difference for that level up in efficiency.
How about my favorite feature? And I think this is what I was chasing when I went to Oxygen from Elementor, and then got even a better boost when I went to Blocks. Is just the performance of things. Have you noticed a big difference just between Oxygen and Blocks?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like one of the things is like the backend load performance, like you said. I've shared in other videos that like sometimes I'll refresh and it will refresh so fast that I didn't even know whether it refreshed or not. So I do it again. And that is massive. And then the front end performance, it's kind of more on the GeneratePress side, but using GeneratePress, even with no optimizations, no perf matters, no image optimization, you're still probably going to be in like the high 80s for like a just out of the gate site with like 4 meg images that you've uploaded. It's still going to be pretty dang good. So the performance is just off the charts with essentially no real effort. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. And I know in interviewing Tom, the developer of GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks, I can't remember if this was in the interview we did or just in a conversation we had, but I was talking about, how his goal is to be able to write generate blocks to be able to spit out the code he would write just as if he was writing it himself, right? Like no extras inside of there. And he said basically at the point I was talking with him, there was one extra div every time you brought in a section that he wished didn't had to be there, but it needed to be there for this reason or that. But it's pretty amazing, especially if you go look at the code inside Elementor or something, like there's one extra div written into the program that he wishes wasn't there. Actually, I think that's going to be eliminated in a future update. So there'll be no extra divs, but it's just amazing. Like, I couldn't go in there and understand every bit of code, but just right click and view the source code in an Elementor site and a block site that are somewhat similar, and the difference is tenfold. It's a huge amount of difference.
That interview is really fantastic. If you're somebody that's well, I'll say another huge decision in the switch for wherever I went, whether it was bricks, which I did seriously consider, and then really those were the two options. It was bricks or kind of this generate blocks, generate press route. And a big piece of it was the stability of the team behind the products. That was a big motivating factor for me. And any of you that know the background know exactly why that is. So with that interview with Tom, the other thing that struck me is like their development process is slow, but it's really methodical, and you can trust that the updates that are coming are the best possible that they can be. And I noticed in the interview, like he's almost the embodiment of that as a person, where you would ask him a question and he would kind of think for a second and he would ponder. And then his answer would be slow, but it would be articulate and well thought out. And it's like that I realized in that moment, like that's the kind of person, that I want to put my trust into. And that's not a knock on Thomas from Bricks. I think that dude is extremely smart. I think they're doing some incredible things. Their development is lightning fast. And there's huge advocates for bricks too. But ultimately for me, there's so many different elements. There wasn't one specific event that made me choose this route, but ultimately we've both said it that like not every tool is the right fit for every person.
Yeah.
And you just have to decide, is that the right, is it the right tool for you? And for me and you and many others, these tools are for sure.
Yeah, no, there was a post last week, I think, in the group about like the FOMO with all these builders. There's so many different things to try, and like people are getting really great results with this or this. There's this brand new thing over here, and that is real and that exists. But I swear, I've not had any of that since I made this move. I love these tools so much, and I get so geeked out about them that I see the other things come out and I test them out. If there's a version I can try, or whatever. I've played around with bricks in their sandbox area and stuff. It's cool, but it's just not for me. I'm not interested. I've kind of found where I want to be, and I really don't suffer from that FOMO anymore. So I know that's not going to be the answer for everybody. They're not going to come to Generate Blocks and feel that same way, but man, I'm really glad to have found the tool where that just doesn't bother me anymore. So if you can find that place, that's definitely where you need to be.
For sure. There's an element of putting on blinders, but I think that's valuable.
Yeah. All right. So one thing that I think people have talked about in their move to blocks, and I'm wondering if this is true for you. Obviously, the way WordPress is built, there's the core of WordPress, and then which almost feels like a fraction of what you actually get, and then there's everybody that's contributed to it, which is like everything we really want. However, the more and more things we add on to it, the more complex it gets, the more we have to worry about things being compatible with each other, all that. I know we've all experienced that with builders and third-party add-ons and things like that. So I know some people's thoughts in the move that they've made to blocks is just to be closer to like the native of WordPress. I know I'm using GenerateBlocks, which isn't native WordPress blocks, and I still kind of avoid native WordPress blocks, but it's built on that same foundation, the same principle, the same setup as those core blocks are. So is that something that played a role in this decision for you?
Yeah, it really is because like Elementor and even all the way back to like WP Bakery, it's true of Oxygen. Like your content is sort of like molded to fit their ecosystem. Like it's wrapped in shortcodes with unique styles that only apply to that builder. The things like paragraphs and headlines are not really your paragraphs and headlines. They're your text, but they're wrapped in other stuff. And that was something for me that always kind of kept me up at night with Oxygen or even WP Bakery. I thought if something goes wrong with this plugin, like my whole site is just botched. Like the whole thing is gone, and it would be extremely difficult for me to pull my content out of this. Where like it's not just Generate Blocks; it's actually true of Gutenberg as a whole. If you go switch to the code interface version as opposed to the visual, I mean, you can literally see it's an H2 and your text is right there with your styles. Right. So like it's very, very close. And of course, Generate Blocks puts their own spin on it. You're using the Generate Blocks elements, but you're far, far closer to it. And people have a very negative opinion of Gutenberg. And what's interesting about that is I strongly believe those people that hate it have never used it for more than 30 seconds. They look at it and they go, yuck. And then they move back into their builder of choice, which is fair. For a long time, I did that too. But spending more time in it, I really realized like the merit of this and the foundation that it's built on, it's really good. So I would say in terms of like, weight in where that particular decision fell, it was relatively low on the list, but it was kind of back of mind for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it makes a difference. I feel like my sites, I've pared down my stack tremendously. Like I've moved from SEO Press, which is really complicated, to like Slim SEO, just because it makes it simpler. So I've kind of done that across the board. Like, how can I simplify all this? But I do feel like my sites are a lot more stable now than they used to be when I was relying on like a big third-party builder and then add-ons that other people have made for that builder. And it was just a lot of moving parts there that made me nervous.
Yeah, I was always terrified to run updates, and that's not really the case anymore.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I want to ask this. Who should not switch to blocks? Like you have people come to you all the time asking for advice because you're somebody that makes videos on the internet. So who's the kind of person that would come to you where you'd say, yeah, I know that I'm doing all this content and I've moved my agency there, but you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, that's a big contingent of, I think, the people that actually follow me on YouTube. I think my blocks content doesn't perform nearly as well as the Oxygen content. And the reason why I think that is the shift in mindset required to adapt a tool like this really comes down to being okay with not needing to be a part of every nitty-gritty detail of every facet of your site. It's like, for me, I love cars and like working on cars. Like, most of us use a car on a regular basis, but the vast majority of people don't really care to get under the hood and, change their spark plugs and that kind of thing. Where like, that excites me. I want to do that kind of thing. And the same thing is true with, Bricks or Oxygen or any other really adept tool like that. If you're someone who wants that granular control over every facet of the site, then Gutenberg and really any blocks plugin except maybe like Quickly are probably not the tool for you. But if you're someone who wants to build really fast sites, you can do it super quickly. You don't have to fiddle around with classes or any kind of like individual styling. You can put together sites that look good and function really well in seriously record time. Like it's wild how quickly you can do it. So I think it really comes down to that. It's like, are you okay with building a really strong website that maybe you don't, focus on every individual detail, or do you want every possible, bit of control that you can have? That would be kind of the balance that you have to find.
I mean, it's a compromise. Every tool is a compromise, right? Using WordPress is a compromise. If, when I talked to Kevin Powell on that interview I did with him, that's not a compromise he's willing to make. Like, he's going to hand code everything from scratch because he wants that control over everything. I'm willing to make the compromise of having this CMS that kind of gets the ball rolling for me really quickly. And I'm okay with the trade-offs I have to make with something like blocks versus something, a little bit crazier, more in-depth type thing.
It's funny with that. I thought about doing a video or maybe a live stream of like, how far can I get with a hand coded site? Like just on the basic HTML and CSS that I know. And I think I could get, I could get something functional and working. But then I thought, but that's such a monumental waste of time. Like there are so many things that are just handled for you out of the box, or a simple plugin like Slim SEO just does for you. And it's kind of the same thing with, like, it's that step from raw HTML to WordPress as it is, I think, from blocks to a tool like Bricks or Oxygen, where like some people are going to consider it a waste of time, and then some people are going to consider it an absolute necessity for them. And I think that's what it comes down to. And especially somebody like Kevin, who is extremely adept enough. Right. He can do it.
Yeah. I tried to make like a simple little link tree a couple months ago just with HTML, CSS. About an hour into it, I'm like, this is pointless. Like, I could have done it, but I'm like, this isn't worth it. I'm just going to go back to WordPress where I feel comfortable.
For sure.
Well, like you mentioned kind of in the intro here, definitely a lot of people know you from the Oxygen community, and you had an Oxygen course. That's how I learned how to build sites in Oxygen, was going through your course. And I know as you made this switch to blocks, you started kind of figuring out all those processes and how you would explain them and all that. And last week you just launched a blocks course. So I want to give you a little bit of time to tell us kind of what went into that, what people can find inside that course, who the course might be good for. So kind of the floor is yours. I will say I did already go through the course the day it went out. I came through everything. So I can fill in some of those blanks too.
Yeah, awesome. So the thing that I realized, and actually you said to me the very first time you ever took me kind of on a behind the scenes tour of GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks, you said to me, I distinctly recall, I could take you to the exact place I was when you said this. You were like, you were going to have to rebuild the first sites that you do because you're gonna mess it up and you're gonna do it wrong. And that's exactly what happened. I built like 3 different client sites in it. I rebuilt my main kind of tutorial website. I did my agency site, and the further back in time I go with those, the worse the setups are. Where like maybe like the way that I achieved like mobile responsiveness is not quite that good, or my global colors are not named in a logical way. So there's a lot of like foundational pieces that I realized like I could shortcut this for people and shave off, hours or weeks of development time, or excuse me, of learning time. Um, so really the course is like it's almost as though it's like a one-to-one coaching session where I'm walking you through everything that you would need to know to get up to speed with GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks specifically. So like going to start from the ground up, totally blank site, and build from, the first steps, which are things like typography styles, global colors, global styles, those sorts of foundational things that will then allow you to do kind of what we already touched on in this video of that ultra efficiency, building things really quickly and not fiddling with classes and styles and stuff like that later on down the line, just building your content and getting to it. So the course has been really good. It was an exercise for me too, and just making sure that I was doing things really efficiently. And really, like, all these client sites, I built like basically from a blank WordPress install every time, so that I would go through these motions over and over and over and over, and then could convey that to somebody, and I could make the same mistakes that somebody's going to make, as many times as I did.
Yeah, and if I'm 100% honest, it was a little surprising that you were going to make a course so early into using these tools, right? But I actually think going through the course now that was the best move possible, because you're in a way better position to relate to the people who are seeing this for the first time than I am. Like, I have no ambition to make a course, but if I did, I would forget the questions that people are going to ask, right? Because it's been too long since I did that. I would assume way too much knowledge. And that's one thing that I thought was really great going through your courses. You explain the things that I probably would have glossed over, but are very important, right? Because you're just a lot closer to being able to do that. And the other thing that's really nice about it too is there's courses of all kinds, right? I'm a course junkie. I've been through a ton of them. Sometimes you need to get really in the weeds, in depth on something, and there's 100 different lessons for it, and you have to watch them 2 or 3 times, and that's just what the subject matter is. In this case, I think the people that are watching this course probably already have a good familiarity with WordPress and what a website is and things like that. So there's just no fluff in it. Like, you hit the ground running on, like, this is the first step we're going to take. You click these buttons here, you go through this. Hey, this over here, it exists. Here's what it does, but I never use this, so we're not going to waste time on it. And that's what I really appreciated about it is, I don't know, it's a couple hours worth of content. You could go through all of this in a day if you wanted to. If you're following along, it might take you a couple days, but there's just not a whole lot of unnecessary fluff to like pad out how long the course content is or anything like that, which I think is a really good move.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because that was actually a conscious goal of mine from the outset. Was I didn't want it to be a monotonous look at every toggle switch on the site. Like, we could take the time to do that, but ultimately it's not really that valuable. Like, there are multiple sections in the the customizer in the backend that we don't even click into because there's just no reason to. Either we do something else later in the course that sort of overrides that anyway. And so I just thought, I want to make this. My thought process was, I want to make this a course that I would want to watch and not be frustrated by those crazy rabbit holes you go down. And then also I wanted it to be almost as though like you were standing looking over my shoulder, and I was showing you like the things that you need as like a hit the ground running, get rolling, kind of quick and dirty. The other thing I was going to mention is my Oxygen course is coming up on 3 years old at this point. And just from the stats, I know people still reference those videos. And I think it's because the tool is so complicated, and you just forget. There are so many different little things. And I think that will probably be true to some degree, but probably not to the same extent. I think within the first, I really do think you can get your head around these tools really comprehensively in probably a few site builds. I would say within 3 actual site builds for clients or yourself, you're going to have a really decent handle on, basically the ins and outs of the whole thing. Yeah. And that's what the course kind of shortcuts for you.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's worth it. Just that learning curve. I know I love to field generate blocks and generate press questions, so I get them pretty much daily. But man, you can shortcut a lot of that figuring it out thing. And I will say, we can go back to one of the cons too, is not everything inside of GeneratePress, especially GeneratePress, less so in GenerateBlocks, is completely intuitive. Like, they're working on some of those things. I think I understand what the problem is. It's like GeneratePress existed for long before GenerateBlocks did, and it was able to do a lot of the things that GenerateBlocks can do. Then GenerateBlocks comes along and creates kind of better ways to do it, and now there's competing ways to do these things, and it's not always obvious. So they're in the process, and this last update did a good job of it, of kind of like, when blocks can do something better, it's kind of circumventing and canceling out the way it was done in GeneratePress. But there is like a lot of, why is this thing over here? And like somebody will ask something that seems like it's simple, and it's like, oh, well, it's kind of a quirk. You got to go over here and click that and click this and click that. And then boom, it's right there. And often it makes sense after that, but you wouldn't know it just looking at the interface. And I think going through this in a course is definitely going to help shortcut some of those bang your head against the desk type moments.
Yeah, like one of the examples that I can think of is you can set your global colors and typography for different elements on your site. Like the example I know off the top of my head is for buttons. So like you would go to your appearance customizer and you would say, I want my button to be my primary blue background, and then, or actually blue is a bad example because it's blue by default. I want it to be my primary red. And then you say, I want the typography to look like this, and I want it to be this size. And then you go to GenerateBlocks global styles and you add in a button. You're like, wait a second, my button's not red and my typography styles aren't there. And that's what you're talking about, where it's like they're almost, but like not quite. Yeah. And there's not many of those, and none of them are earth-shattering. None of them are groundbreaking. But there are times where you're like, but I already set the button color. So,
and I think that specific example is one that's going to be fixed too. But it is the problem of just like, they are two separate products, right? Like you can build an entire website with GeneratePress and use GeneratePress's buttons, and all those default styles will apply. But if you bring in a GenerateBlocks one, they just weren't talking. But I think that's something they're fixing as well. So yeah, I definitely think people can save themselves a little bit of frustration going through that. And like I said, just be up and running quickly. And I don't think either one of us are the type of people to say like, we need to get on a call and convince everybody to use blocks. And I don't think that's the point of this call either. It's just, I wanted to talk to you about it as somebody that's doing this switch fairly recently, because I know there's a lot of people out there that are like, man, I'm really curious about doing this, but I'm just not sure if I can pull the trigger. And my hope is that, we brought up some of the concerns people had and we could talk about them realistically, because.
Yeah. And, there's something I'm thinking about as you're saying that, which is like, my good buddy Ryan, like he has a fantastic business and everything he does is an Elementor. And I was talking to him a week or so ago and I was like, man, you could do what you do here so much easier in blocks. And then he was like, yeah, but we do everything we need to do. It works great in Elementor. And I was like, it's very true. And it reminded me of these frustrating conversations I used to have with my friends where I was early on in kind of the entrepreneur, self-employed kind of thing. And I would be preaching this to my friends. You got to start a business, leave your job, start a business. And then I realized I'm not going to be able to convince these people to do this just, by hounding them over and over. It has to be kind of an organic decision and an organic, movement to that point. And I think the same thing is true here. Like if you're someone who is looking for a new tool and maybe some of the pros that we've talked about resonate with you, it's probably worth looking. But if your business is running smoothly and you're super adept in Elementor and it does everything you need to do, it's not worth it.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
100%.
That's it.
Exactly.
Well, sweet. Well, I will put links to everything we talked about your course. I know we talked about several different plugins in here as well, so I'll put links to all that. Disclosure, probably links down there in the video description are affiliate links, and I earn a little bit of commission for sharing those with y'all. So do appreciate if you click on those, but if you don't want to, go Google it your damn self. All right. Well, fantastic, Jonathan. I really appreciate you coming on here today, and hopefully this video will help some folks. I'll make sure to put a link to your channel in there as well, and I'm sure you can answer any questions folks have about the course.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right. Fantastic. We'll catch you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.